What if I told you, in the Wild West, a bullet wasn't what you needed to fear the most? When people imagine the American frontier, they picture gunfights in dusty streets, outlaws facing off at high noon, sheriffs risking their lives with every step. It feels dangerous, unpredictable, violent. But the numbers tell a completely different story. Historians estimate that in the most famous cattle towns of the American West, Dodge City, Abilene, Tombstone, the average number of murders per year rarely exceeded 5. Some years it was 0. For all the mythology around gunfights, most people on the frontier never witnessed one in their entire lives. What they did witness was something far quieter and far more deadly. Because most people didn't die from bullets. They died from cholera, from typhoid fever, from tetanus caused by a simple cut that never healed, from drinking water that looked clean but carried invisible killers. Things that today barely slow us down could end a life in days on the American frontier. And the scariest part? It didn't look dangerous at first. You could wake up feeling fine, go about your day, ride for miles under the sun, and still have no idea that something had already started inside your body. Something you couldn't see, something you couldn't stop. There were no reliable doctors waiting nearby, no safe hospitals, no medicine you could trust, just a harsh environment, limited knowledge, and a body left to fight on its own. And when you begin to understand how life actually worked in the Wild West, you realize something that changes everything. The real danger wasn't sudden, it was slow, quiet, and by the time most people realized what was happening, it was already too late. Have you ever ignored a small symptom, thinking it was nothing, and later realized it was more serious than you thought? Go down in the comments and tell me. I read every single one. If this kind of real, raw, Wild West history pulls you in, the kind that goes beyond the myths, take a second to like the video. And if you want to keep exploring the darker side of the frontier, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see next reveals what truly made life out there so dangerous. At first, life in the Wild West didn't feel as deadly as we imagine today. It felt normal. People woke up, worked, traveled, built towns, raised families. There was routine, there was purpose, there was even a sense of opportunity. And that's exactly what makes the reality so unsettling. Because the danger wasn't always obvious. When we think about the American frontier, we picture gunfights, outlaws, chaos. But for most people, those moments were rare. The real risk wasn't standing in the middle of a dusty street facing an enemy with a gun. It was living your everyday life completely unaware of what could quietly go wrong. Take the summer of 1878 along the cattle trails of Kansas. That year, a wave of cholera moved through frontier settlements so quickly that entire families were gone within a week. Not from violence, not from outlaws, from contaminated water in the rivers they depended on every single day. Travelers who passed through those areas had no idea. They drank from the same rivers, they cooked with the same water, they felt fine in the morning, and by evening their bodies were already beginning to fail. That's what made it so dangerous. The threats people faced weren't loud or immediate. They were subtle. They blended into daily life. They felt manageable at first, almost insignificant, and because of that, they were often dismissed. People didn't panic over a small issue. They kept going. They had to. Survival in the Wild West demanded constant movement, constant effort. Stopping wasn't always an option. But the Wild West didn't forgive that movement. It didn't give second chances to ignored signs. And while everything on the surface looked normal, beneath that routine, something far more dangerous was unfolding, something that didn't need violence to take a life. If this already changed the way you see danger in the Wild West, comment silent below. And this is where the reality of the Wild West becomes much harder to ignore. Because once something went wrong, people quickly realized that the real danger wasn't just what was happening to them, it was the fact that no one could truly help. In 1870, there was roughly one physician for every 600 people on the American frontier, and most of them had no more than a year of formal training. Medical schools of the era didn't require laboratory work, didn't teach germ theory, and in many cases accepted students who had never treated a single patient before graduation. So when you got sick on the frontier, the person who showed up to help often didn't know what was wrong with you, and the treatments they offered reflected that. Bloodletting, deliberately cutting a patient to drain blood, was still practiced well into the 1870s based on the belief that bad blood caused disease. Mercury-based compounds were prescribed for everything from infections to digestive problems, slowly poisoning the patients they meant to cure. Wounds were packed with materials that introduced more bacteria than they removed. People weren't being treated carelessly. They genuinely believed these methods worked. But belief wasn't enough, and reaching help wasn't simple. Distances between towns were vast. If you were already weak, traveling could make things worse. Doctors often traveled by horse to reach patients, sometimes arriving hours too late, sometimes not arriving at all. That's what made it so dangerous. Not just the problem itself, but the isolation, the realization that as things got worse, your options weren't expanding, they were disappearing. And this is where things take a turn that most people today would struggle to imagine. Because in the Wild West, it didn't take a dramatic event for everything to go wrong. It only took something small. In 1876, a cattle driver named Calvin Reasoner, documented in frontier medical records from Texas, suffered a minor cut on his right hand while mending a fence. He cleaned it as best he could, wrapped it with cloth, and kept working. There was no reason to stop. The cattle needed moving. The job had to be done. Within 4 days, the wound had darkened. Within a week, the infection had spread past his wrist. The frontier doctor who eventually reached him had no antibiotics, no sterile tools, and only one real option left: amputation. Reasoner survived. Many others in similar situations did not. Because without proper cleaning, without sterile tools, and without understanding how infection worked, those small injuries didn't stay small for long. Dirt entered the wound, bacteria spread. What once looked harmless slowly started to change. At first, maybe just discomfort, then pain, then something deeper, something that no longer responded to rest or simple treatment. Think about that for a second. Something as simple as a cut, something you wouldn't even remember a week later today, could begin a chain of events that led somewhere much darker. And the worst part is that it didn't happen instantly. It happened gradually, quietly, giving the illusion that everything was still under control, until suddenly it wasn't. If this made you realize how dangerous something so small could become, comment "one cut" below. And this is where everything becomes even more unsettling, because at this stage, it wasn't just the injury or the infection working against you. It was everything around you. The water that frontier settlers depended on was rarely safe. Rivers and wells were shared by people, livestock, and waste, often within yards of each other. A study of frontier settlement patterns from the late 19th century found that the majority of water sources in cattle regions showed contamination that today would make them immediately unusable. Typhoid fever spread this way, so did dysentery, so did cholera, the disease that during certain years in the 1970s and 80s killed more Americans on the frontier than any other single cause. And the contamination wasn't always visible. The water looked clear. It tasted normal. There was nothing to warn you before you drank it. So people drank it, cooked with it, cleaned their wounds with it, and unknowingly made an already difficult situation worse. Even the things meant to help became part of the problem. Medical tools weren't sterilized between patients. Bandages were reused. The same cloth that covered one infected wound was cleaned, dried, and used on the next person. Hands weren't washed the way we understand today, not because people were negligent, because germ theory wasn't widely accepted in medical practice until the 1880s, and even then it took decades to fully change how care was delivered. So when someone tried to help, a neighbor, a family member, even a doctor, they often didn't realize they were introducing more risk. That's what made survival in the Wild West so unpredictable. It wasn't just what happened to you, it was about where you were. And when everything combined, a weakened body, contaminated water, ineffective treatment, the situation stopped being manageable. It became a race the body was unlikely to win. And this is where everything finally comes together, because after everything you've seen, the silent beginnings, the absence of real help, the way small injuries escalated, the environment that made recovery nearly impossible, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. In the Wild West, it was never really about avoiding danger. It was about how long you could delay it. The frontier was brutal not because of what it did dramatically, but because of what it did constantly, invisibly, to ordinary people living ordinary lives. A man could survive a gunfight on Saturday and be dead from infection by Thursday. A woman could give birth successfully and be gone from fever within a week. Children died from diseases that today require nothing more than a vaccine or a round of antibiotics. The U.S. Census records from frontier territories in the 1870s and 1880s paint a picture that no Western film ever has. Life expectancy in many regions hovered around 40 years, not because of outlaws, not because of wars, because of the silent, patient, invisible things that the frontier made impossible to